Okay, so welcome to our second day of the Bilateral Labor Agreements Conference. Today we have two sessions. The first is titled Appraising Bilateralism, and the second is Categorizing Rights. In between them, we'll have a virtual get-together, so more details about that later on, and a coffee break. And without further ado, I want to start by welcoming our first speakers. So our first speaker is Maurice from the University of Western Australia Law School. And he's going to be talking about advancing migrant workers' social protection, a critical evaluation of bilateralism. I'll say that this is a particularly important paper for this conference because it's one of the only ones who's really paying attention to social protection, social security, and this very, very important issue for migrant workers. So thank you so much, Marius, for all your research about this and for joining us today. The discussant will be Rebecca Smith from the Labor Mobility Partnership and Center for Global Development. Rebecca will also be presenting her paper with Susanna Tepla later today. So thank you both for joining us. And Marius, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hila, and colleagues. Thank you also for the opportunity to participate in the conference. Thank you also for Tamar, who will be helping with managing the slides. The topic is a vast topic. We will only be able to scratch the surface in this 10 to 12 minutes presentation. The full paper has been uploaded. It's work in progress. It is a complex, complicated, and a comprehensive area too. Now, there are three parts to the paper. Next slide, please. The first part deals with accessing social protection, the barriers faced by migrant workers, but also bilateral responses. Due to the limited time that we have, I've decided not really to concentrate on this. Other than to say that migrant workers generally face significant problems or challenges in relation to accessing social protection. And that's one reason why bilateral social security agreements in particular, and less so bilateral labor agreements, are meant to serve as a gold standard for improving their social protection status. I would, however, like to focus on the two other parts of the paper. The next slide would start with the first of the two issues, where we actually now confront the limitations and shortcomings of bilateralism itself. Of course, there are quite a number of perspectives here. And the first issue that I would like to touch on briefly relates to bilateral social security and bilateral labor agreements, then the links to labor migration, free movement, and equal treatment. To a very large extent, BSAs, bilateral social security agreements, share the same objective of, bilateral labor agreements, kind of to manage labor migration, if you like, but of course from a social protection perspective. However, I think what is particularly pronounced, more so I think than the case of BLAs, is the close nexus that very often, not always, but increasingly actually, the BSAs would have with free movement regimes and regional integration agendas. So there's a very close nexus, which we kind of elaborate a little bit more on in the paper. And free movement in turn would require or imply equality of treatment. And it has a very particular interesting angle, at least in the European context, and we haven't seen this yet in other contexts, but I wouldn't be amazed if that would be developing. And that is the following, that in a very important case of 15, 16 years ago, the European Court of Justice in Gotthard suggests that if a European Union country, which is bound by the regulation in the European Union on the coordination of social security schemes, were to enter into a bilateral social security agreement with a third country, then any benefits and entitlements that would arise from that BSA with the third country would have to be extended directly and automatically to all other EU citizens in relation to the EU member state that has, entered into this contract. This BSI, apology. So it just shows you that at least in the EU, how far this is taken. It has further ramifications we can't discuss now. Let me also say about free movement, it also has important implications for bilateral labor agreements, not always well understood, but especially for those bilateral labor agreements which would fall within a framework of let's say, free movement instrument, like we have in Africa. There are quite a few of them actually, that would guarantee free movement of workers. Then it has implications for the restriction of access to the labor markets of the countries which will fall under that particular regime. Next slide. So the second issue, in short, that it was with inadequate social protection provision contained in BLAs. I think it's clear, those of us who work in this area, that usually, if at all, very limited provision is made in BLAs for social protection, perhaps sometimes health insurance, perhaps sometimes occupational injury insurance. But by and large, it is not tailored, at least not until now, to deal with social protection appropriately. The ILO's official position on this is that there should be accompanying bilateral social security agreements to deal with this. I'll come back to that issue. But let me also say that if you were to analyze, for example, the model agreement attached to the ILO recommendation 86 of 49 that deals actually with a template for BLAs, it reinforces what I've just told you, the limited provision, from that perspective. However, I think it has to be noted that the Global Compact 2018 has adopted a much wider approach. In my view, a more preferable approach that would suggest social protection flaws would need to be included while even in BLAs, as you'll see it in a moment, as is the case with applicable social security entitlements and provisions. The final issue here is that a synergized approach, one would think, is appropriate. Unfortunately, not many countries do so. But one very good example of where this is being done is in the case of Canada and its respective BLAs and BLA and BSAs with Mexico, which kind of nicely gel together, as you can see in the last point made there. Next slide. The limited scope of BLAs and BSAs, to a large extent, we have talked about BLAs already. But we find that across the board, both types of agreements, that workers in an irregular situation and informal economy workers, so generally speaking, not be covered. It has significant implications, not just for protection of these workers, but literally that by far, very often the majority of those in the developing world who work as migrant workers plainly just be excluded from any kind of coverage under these agreements. Furthermore, we see that BSAs, which could in principle cover quite a range of matters, very often very restricted even in its material scope, that not all BSAs, for example, would arrange for portability, to give you one example. Next slide has to do with the still as a limitation shortcoming, the weak bargaining power and the lack of enforceability. We can go to the next slide, please. In fact, we have a tendency, work recently done in Southern Africa, that there's some countries who increasingly just refuse to enter into BLAs and prefer the less exacting, less rights-based approach MAUs. Then next slide, the multiplicity and non-alignments of bilateral social security agreements. So what do we have in the world? We have around 2,000 BSAs all in all. Some countries have concluded quite a number of them. But now the implication of that is that these agreements are all individualized. So you have, so many arrangements that would have to be taken care of administratively, very different arrangement. Social security is a very technical area, I must say. And sometimes, for example, you may have countries, different countries within a certain block of countries where you have different social security arrangements. Let's say the Philippines, for example, you have quite a number of BSAs with some European countries. And apart from what I said about Gotado, the point here just is that you start treating migrant workers differently because of the interest at stake, the negotiation power of the parties, etc. And that is one reason why more and more the argument is being made for an increased multilateral approach. Also, alignment with tax treaties is a problem, and an issue that I wish I had time to discuss, but I'm not going to do so. The extremely difficult area of how to align BSAs with commitments under trade and services agreements. So let's rather continue to the next slide. Of course, you still have the next topic as well. The final issue on the limitation shortcomings has to do, and quite importantly so, with the changing nature of labor migration. I mean, we really see an increase, at least from a developing world perspective, of short-term migration, circular migration, seasonal workers being covered by agreements. There are movements for shorter periods of time, and increasingly also between several countries. And I think the EU is a good example of people that's very often moving, once they are illegally in the EU, just moving from one country to the other. So it is being said also in 2016 contribution of the Economic Social Committee of the European Council that bilateralism has its material and formal limits. A more comprehensive approach may be needed. And finally, the last topic, but there are a few matters as far as that is concerned. The next slide, please. Responding to shortcomings in bilateral regimes. So the four matters that we are going to mention briefly, they must be seen as complementary, but also contextualized. Not all of them may simultaneously apply to all four scenarios, as you will understand when we discuss this. What should be our starting point? And again, I think we should take Objective 22, paragraph 38 of the Global Compact as a very good starting point. And I'm quoting, it says, to assist migrant workers at all skills levels to have access to social protection in countries of destination and profit from the portability of applicable social security entitlements and earn benefits in their country of origin or when they decide to take up work in another country, unquote. Very, very important. In fact, if you go to the next slide, the first area that we want to reflect on briefly, i.e. strengthening social protection provision in BLAs. Please note the much broader sweep of the Global Compact, again referring to social protection floors and social security entitlements and provisions, which should be embedded so that GCM suggests in even in BLAs. It assumes the equality of treatment principle, at least as far as contributory forms of social security are concerned. One would mean, as I've said, think that this should be reflected not just in BLAs, but even in the standard employment contracts. Of critical importance here is that when we look at the strengthening of social protection provisions in BLAs, that we have to make sure that it is appropriately aligned with modern continental and regional instruments. Just to quote the African instruments, both the continental one, Free Movement Protocol, Article 19, and then a few of the other free movement regimes in Africa, they actually, guarantee, subject to some exception, free movement of workers, but not just that, but social security protection of workers, migrant workers who move. There's a need for improved enforcement and supporting measures. Let's go to the next slide, the second issue here.
I'll just say that we're beginning to run out of time, so if you can.
Yes. As you can see, I'm rushing. Investing in enhanced multilateral social security arrangements. The argument for this is increasingly made, and in fact, the practice around the world is indeed confirming this. We compare the world with where it was in this area 20, 30 years ago. It's not the same. Of course, the European arrangement is a very old one, starting in 1957, but Almost all of the other multilateral arrangements are a product of the last 20 years, and there are many, many of them. In fact, the first intercontinental multilateral security agreement involving two of the Latin American states, countries, two of the European countries, Spain, Portugal, and almost the whole of Latin America. Right, let me leave it there. Responding to the next, second last issue, extending the scope of bilateral social security agreements and incremental approaches applying to both multilateral and bilateral social security agreements. The next slide, please. Can something be done to address the plight of migrants and workers in the irregular situation more? Well, we have a few interesting examples. Thailand, South Africa have actually extended, in the case of South Africa, by way of bilateral agreement, protection to or regularize the status of irregular migrant workers. And for migrant workers in the informal economy, all that I want to say, it's a huge topic on its own, is the following, that we see, generally speaking, in the world that special regimes are being created to cater for the social protection of informal economy workers generally. And there's no reason why this cannot be transported to or extended to migrant workers in informal economy. A five-dimensional incremental approach is indeed not just foreseeable, but especially in multilateral agreements. This is how they have developed even in Europe. You would have seen an incremental expansion of the types of schemes covered by the agreements, the range of benefits provided for, the categories of persons covered by such an agreement, the countries included in the agreement, and finally the social security coordination principles involved. Very interesting area. Finally, introducing social, next slide, country of origin unilateral measures. This is the last resort. This is not a preferred option. Preferred option is, it should remain, that countries of destination take up the responsibility that they have and should have legally, also in terms of international norms. But very often that's not the case. Or if they do so, even by way of bilateral agreements, the protection and the agreements are inadequate. So we see a tendency, a sharply rising tendency, many developing countries to start extending some forms of unilateral social security, social protection support to their own workers abroad. They do this in many ways. They establish migrant welfare funds, and nowadays even more so, they've started extending or establishing dedicated social security schemes covering their own migrant workers abroad. And this then is supported by complementary institutional arrangements. We don't have any international or regional normative framework currently regulating this. The only guidelines. This is a drawback to some extent. On the other hand, as I've said, we should always see this as a measure of last resort. So thank you so much, and sorry for the rush, but the paper is available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice, for rushing us through so much, such a rich and interesting paper. And indeed, it will be very interesting to learn more about the interconnections between BLAs and BSAs, and expand this knowledge that we're starting to get in this field. So as a respondent, we have Rebecca Smith with us. Thank you, Rebecca, from the Labor Mobility Partnership and Center for Global Development. Thank you, Rebecca. The floor is yours. Do you need to share screen or?
I don't. I'm afraid I did not have time to prepare.
Fine. I'm just asking. No,
no, so
no pressure.
Yeah, I hope you'll all forgive me that, but I'll just kind of share my musings, I guess. And so, I mean, let me first start by congratulating Maurice on really a very comprehensive overview of a really complex problem, and I appreciate that you were rushing through it, but certainly the paper contained a lot of really detailed information, and I would encourage everyone who might not have read it already to go and read it. I certainly learned quite a lot. Starting with, actually, I personally was not aware that there were 2,000 BSAs in the world, which was, I mean, so it's a much kind of broader and really wide-ranging issue than I personally had been aware of. And I was thinking that I would be very interested to see a similar analysis to what Adam is doing right now on BLAs, of coding these BSAs and looking at kind of the standard provisions and what the impact of them might be. That seems like it would be some very impactful analysis. So in responding to this paper, I wanted to start by just kind of positioning it within the broader context for social security systems. Demography, especially demography of OECD countries, is something we at Labor Mobility Partnerships think about quite a lot. So I think one of the key issues that we need to be considering in discussing BSAs and their future is the aging demographics of OECD countries. One of the things that we say a lot at LAMP is that while there's many things that are very difficult to predict about the future, demography is actually not one of them. Demography is very easy to predict. You just kind of take the people who are alive now and the people who are being born now, and you project that into the future. So it's quite mechanical. And what we see in looking at that is that we know OECD countries are not going to have sufficient workers to maintain their own social security systems. So in a no migration scenario by 2050, OECD countries will lose 92 million working age people and gain 96 million working age people, resulting in a 400 million worker gap to maintain the current working age to elderly ratio. And I realize that sounds maybe a bit dry and technical, but that's actually hugely impactful in that ratio is what determines the design of our pension systems, our welfare systems. And dipping below that ratio, or dipping significantly below it as we can expect to, means that all of these systems are kind of imminently at threat. Without addressing this 400 million worker gap, OECD safety nets are effectively expected to either need to be severely cut or go bankrupt. And it is an interesting scenario in that same kind of imbalance between working age people and elderly retired people is a really strong argument for greater BLAs and expansion of migration. At the same time, I wonder if that might, and I will admit that I have not thought about this deeply and the implications of it, I wonder if that might be a constraining factor in OECD's countries' willingness to expand their social security systems. So I think that, I mean, in thinking about and talking about the expansion of BSAs and access to social safety nets, we actually have to think about the future of social safety nets, which for the moment is kind of far from certain. So I think it is worth considering that and how it might affect the possible options and dynamics at play here. Kind of jumping forward, but building off of that, you set out the problems of access very, very clearly in this paper. And I think, as I say, offer a really detailed and comprehensive view of them. But in order to solve them, I came away from the paper feeling like I wanted a clearer picture of what is driving these problems and what is preventing them right now from being resolved, in terms of understanding kind of what our options for moving forward are. And so, yeah, I was left wanting to know why these problems of BSAs have persisted. My guess would be that there has not been the political will to expand the scope of social protection systems. And so in thinking about the options and discussing the limitations, it seemed to me that we also needed to propose a solution to that problem of political will. You mentioned, and in your presentation mentioned as well, that countries of origin haven't been able to negotiate BSAs because of that kind of imbalance in political dynamics and leverage between countries of origin and destination. So this seems to me to be a fundamental problem. Certainly it's a fundamental problem in BLAs that we've discussed throughout the conference, and it seems like that problem we would expect to play out in BSAs as well. So I would be really interested, Maurice, in hearing more of your thoughts on this my very kind of quick thinking in reading your paper and some of the different pathways to resolving this political will issue were first that you mentioned portability as a way of facilitating return, including what I thought was the incredibly powerful statistic that without current portability arrangements, fewer than 30% of migrants worldwide who return home would have done so, which absolutely blew my mind. That's a huge statistic. And given that orderly return is so on the mind of countries of destination, it seems to me that that's a really powerful lever in strengthening BSAs and expanding their scope. So I mean, if I were more investing in this field and talking to countries, I feel like I would be shouting that statistic from the rooftop. So that seemed to me to be a way to change those political dynamics. There's, of course, the second point, just that outside of social protection systems, while we have to think about kind of this fiscal balance problem that I've already mentioned, migrants also generate economic growth through increased productivity as workers and on the demand side as consumers, which also generates sales tax. All of this seems to me, I mean, these have been key arguments that we've used in terms of expanding labor market access and BLAs. I would imagine that these would also be very important factors in kind of speaking to countries of destination and making the case for expanding BSAs as well. And then finally, and I certainly have kind of no information on this, but Maurice, I'd be interested to hear if you kind of are aware of, come across anything, is I wonder if the COVID pandemic has kind of shifted these political dynamics, even more specifically around BSAs than around labor flows. And that we've seen so many countries expand their safety nets to migrants and informal migrants, and understanding that it was an issue of their own self-interest in terms of protecting their populations throughout the pandemic. So I don't know, but I think it would be worth looking into whether that has expanded to kind of a longer term understanding that for the health of your own societies, it's important to include migrants in portable social protection schemes. So I think if there is information on that, I think it would be worth speaking to in the paper, and I'd be really interested to hear those findings. And then kind of moving to my last reflections on the different proposals that the different solutions you propose. So one of the first solutions that you discussed was around strengthening access to social protection systems through BLAs in the absence of BSAs. Including, for example, that the model agreements annexed to ILO number 86 is kind of not going far enough to encourage portability, and that we should kind of be enhancing that provisioning. My reaction to that is that a lot of the same constraints and limitations you mentioned around BSAs are absolutely present for BLAs as well. So I'm not certain that they would really be an effective tool in solving this problem, in that they haven't been able to kind of solve the problem for BLAs as well. One estimate I saw is that some 25% of bilateral agreements in OECD countries are estimated to really not be implemented. Given that that's kind of what we're all talking about in this conference, I imagine it's quite possible it's much higher than that in reality. I also wonder if there might be an issue of kind of correlation or comorbidity here, in that countries' willingness to sign a BSA may be a signal that bilateral cooperation is already strong. So countries that have strong BLAs that they're actually implementing and enforcing in practice may be the same countries that are also willing to implement or expand BSAs, whereas countries where there is not really willingness to sign BSAs may be the same countries that have weak other forms of bilateral cooperation. I think worth looking into a bit more, perhaps again, if we were able to kind of pair that database from Adam with a database of BSAs. But I didn't see a clear path to solving the BSA problem through BLAs, given that a lot of the same problems are present in there, and we haven't managed to solve that yet either. I really liked your point on the need for institutional administrative strengthening. You'll kind of hear about this a lot later today in our presentation. So this is, I suppose, one of our kind of soapbox points. But I personally am strongly of the belief that in the absence of political will to kind of push larger policy, regulatory, bilateral agreement changes through, you can make significant change by simply improving the functioning of existing agreements. And in doing so, as you really rightfully point out, first, you're just creating meaningful access for migrants in practice. You very rightfully pointed to all of the different administrative barriers that prevent migrants from even taking advantage of the BSAs that do exist now. So first, you simply, of course, help more migrants and improve outcomes from them. But then secondly, I think in doing that, you also increase trust and can create kind of proof of concept or build the evidence on the positive impacts and how to implement these things. And our general theory is that that can then be translated into that expansion of BSA's improved policy. So rather than starting by trying to fix the policies, starting by trying to fix the implementation of existing policy and using that as a lever to fix policy more broadly. I think worth thinking about more broadly. And then your final point on multilateralism. I think you're exactly right that obviously bilateralism is not really keeping up with the migration trends that we're seeing, and certainly not with kind of the increased complexity that we should expect to see in the future. My reaction was something the same as what I said before of, I agree with you on the proposed solution. I'm not yet certain and would be interested to see more discussion of how we get there. At least on kind of the labor movement side, there's significantly more resistance to multilateralism than bilateralism. And there's plenty of resistance to bilateralism as well. And that's a problem we've not solved on, I think, the labor flows side. So I would be interested to hear more of your thinking on how we actually get to multilateralism for portability of social protection schemes. I thought the CARICOM example in Latin America was fascinating, and we've come across them in the Global Forum on Development, and they do seem to be really advanced in their thinking on this. So perhaps kind of a built out case study of how that was achieved and how it's moved to meaningful implementation would be useful in thinking about how we actually get to multilateralism in practice. That's all from me. Congratulations again, really interesting paper, and excited to hear more of your thoughts. Certainly it's an issue that needs kind of all of the thinking that we can get. So excited to hear your response and excited to kind of see more in the next version.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Maurice, would you like to respond briefly and then take questions, or take more questions and then respond?
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually forgot to switch on my video. Let me do it now. Maybe I can just briefly respond to this. We don't have much time. Now, on the other hand, I see we only have a few minutes left. Let's rather, take a few other questions too, and then I can try and address them together. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Alan.
Thanks, Hila. Thanks, Maurice. Very, very interesting paper. So in light of the discussion yesterday, who wants these things and what do they want? Now, I assume it's mostly domestic Social Security administrators. And do they want these things because it makes their life easier? They're trying to do the right thing. They know, perhaps they're in the Philippines, they know their government is encouraging out migration and they want to be part of that. Anyway, if you could address some of yesterday's themes, it would be very helpful.
So let's take Adam's as well. And I'll just say, Maurice, that your camera is not directed at you. So if you want to adjust it, thank you. So Adam.
Hi. So like Rebecca, my initial reaction hearing the statistic that there was 2,000 BSAs, I was blown away. I did not realize how thick this network was. And I was aware that this wasn't really a topic that was meaningfully engaged with most BLAs, but now I am sitting here thinking, why did I not realize that this was such a problem and that there wasn't more attention on this? I had two reactions for things that might, the case that you're making is already extremely strong. So but two thoughts. One is that it would be perhaps useful to do something more like a case study at one point in the paper to describe where it's going well. In part two, towards the end of the paper, you mentioned and discuss how some European countries and some countries have included the BSA terms within BLA and labor agreements. but that it's not enough coverage. So it would be just sort of interesting to know what like a good program looks like and how it functions, to have a better understanding of what we should be shooting for. The second thought is, I mean, you already have so much going on in so much detail, but I wondered if it would be possible to compare this to double taxation treaties. And I don't, really know this area, but my thought had been when I talked to people that study tax treaties, that system works reasonably well, that governments have these treaties with each other and coordinate on who taxes who. There's, a race to the bottom, and that companies are moving their, business practices to whatever, the Cayman Islands or something. But at least there's a network of treaties that clarifies the rules to some extent. And I wonder if there's anything to be leveraged on the BSA and BLA front to behave more like that form of treaties. And if that might be the treaty to link it to, as opposed to just the BLA. And that seemed sort of partially relevant given the news over the last week or so that major financial economies have agreed to coordinate more on global taxes. And so perhaps there's an opening there. Anyway, this was extremely interesting to me, so thanks for the paper.
Thank you very much. So Maurice, you have several minutes to try and respond to whatever you feel you want to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Let me just deal with a few matters. The question about whether it's primarily an issue of political will that may not be present. Of course, it does play a role, but let me say that, increasingly, I think there's an awareness in the world, and also thanks to the good work of the ILO over the years, that, I mean, the entitlement, the right that everyone should have, everyone in the world, to plain social security. I mean, it's a very well entrenched, embedded right in so many, United Nations and ILO instruments. And that, I think, is appreciated. And I think that is actually the driving force for, the increased, despite all the problems, increased usage of multilateral and even bilateral social security agreements. But nevertheless, there may be an issue of political will, but I think there are other issues here. I just made a remark in passing that social security is a very, very technical area. And the moment you start coordinating social security systems and schemes of two countries, let alone on a multilateral basis, it is very, very difficult at times. Of course, some systems may not be fully compatible, and then you have to develop special rules to get to some form or basis of compatibility. It may be, as is the case very often, that the social security system of the country of origin is actually rather weak. So what kind of reciprocity can you then expect through a bilateral social security agreement? It makes it difficult, not impossible, but also because of its technicality, it means that those who negotiate these agreements must really be on top of what they are negotiating. They must understand the issues technically as well. This is a much more technical area than bilateral labor agreements. Right, now, the reaction, Rebecca, as to the same limitations would apply. Let me say this, and I already said about what has been or what is the case in terms of the international instruments approach. But lately, I think there's a general consensus in the world that the idea of a social protection floor that should be extended to all workers, not just workers, should be recognized. And at least whatever kind of bilateral agreement should take note of that. The ILO recommendation 202 on national social protection floors actually say that this should be extended to all residents in a country, so even people who come to work there. Fascinating, the issue of multilateralism, how they have developed. I think there's another question on that too. It has developed incrementally, and let me give you two examples in the world just to show you what has happened in the last 20 years. Roughly. In Latin America, we have seen kind of larger growing concentric circles of smaller multilateral agreements that have forever been extending and expanding to later include all the Latin American agreements. So there's a Mercosur agreement, then there were 2 or 3 other agreements. And then eventually we had the Ibero-American Intercontinental Agreement on Social Security. It's the first example of this in the world. And we're seeing the same in Africa. I mean, 20 years ago, there was, with one or two important exceptions, nothing of this kind of in Africa. But now we have at least a continental basis for multilateralism in Africa. We have 2 or 3 of the regional economic communities that are pressing on as far as this issue is concerned. So in my view, it is clear this is the way the world is going and wants to go. Who wants these things and what do they want? Well, at the very basis, social protection for people generally, for people who work in another country. I mean, that is the baseline approach, which I think all countries, at least extended countries, would want to see. Double taxation treaties, yes. And they are also, of course, very technical. But just this remark, which is elaborated more in the paper, that the problem is also how to align double taxation agreements with bilateral social security agreements. Unfortunately, as is the case, even with BSAs and BLAs, they operate very often in silos. And we must, this is an area to look into. I think for the moment, that's all that we have time for, Hila. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and thank you, Rebecca, and the other participants. I think this is really, deserves a conference of its own. I feel like we're not paying enough attention to it in many of our papers. It's such a key issue, and it's so important to the lives of migrant workers and to the economies they go to and come from. So thank you very much for putting that on the table for us.